should start. Yeah. Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just 1 minute. Thanks, everyone, for joining us virtually and in person. All right, we will get started, and thank you everyone so much for attending. The Women's NBA Association, Lot Club, and the Sports and Social Club are thrilled to host 3 incredible speakers for our Women in Sports Leadership panel. I'm so pleased to welcome and reconnect with each of these 3 notable leaders. First, I'd like to introduce Suzanne Lyons. Suzanne has served as the board chair and president of the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee for the last 3 years, but has been a member of the board since 2010. Suzanne began her career in the financial industry, first with Fidelity and then Charles Schwab. She served as the chief marketing officer and executive VP at Visa for 3 years. Her experience with brand advertising and sponsorship made for a smooth transition into the world of athletics. Suzanne is a Questrom alum and concentrated in marketing. I am now so excited to welcome our second panelist tonight, calling in over the phone, Lisa Borders. Lisa is the founder and CEO of Golden Glow Media and LMB Group LLC. She is the host of the podcast Enlightened, current board member on several committees, and former WNBA president. Additionally, she was the vice president and chair of the Coca-Cola Company for 3 years. Lisa graduated from Duke University and hosts several prominent guest speakers on her podcast, including Coach K, Stacey Abrams, Elena Delle Donne, and Suzanne Lyons. Make sure to subscribe and follow along to Enlightened. Our moderator for this evening is Jamie Mittelman. Jamie is the founder and host of the podcast Flame Bearers, celebrating the journeys of women Olympians and Paralympians athletes for their full selves. Jamie graduated from the Tuck School of Business and is now finishing her Master's of Public Administration at Harvard Kennedy School while working on Flame Bearers. She also has a connection to Questrom with her sister, Melissa, who is a second year in the MBA dual degree program. We will have time at the end for Q&A, and please submit your questions through a link we'll post in the chat. We're so honored to have the 3 of you join us tonight. Thank you again. I'll now hand it over to Jamie.
Amazing. Hi, everyone. Hi, Jamie. I'm so excited to be here. Massive thank you to the Women's NBA Association, the Lot Club, and the Social and Social Club. I feel a little weird kind of splitting between Zoom and the people here, but I'll do my best to kind of go back and forth. Really honored to be able to be here in conversation with both Suzanne and Lisa, 2 women who I think have literally been at the vanguard of women's sports leadership. And I think one of the reasons I admire both of them so much is because they've both really focused on pulling up other women behind them. So really honored to be able to be here today. As Marissa mentioned, if you have questions, Erika will be sharing a link in the chat function. Please put your questions there. So without further ado, let's hop into it. Let's start with Suzanne, please. Can you share what led you to work in athletics?
Sure. Well, a lot of times people get into athletics because they were really good athletes and, it was their personal passion. And I have to say, I'm probably one of the worst athletes in the Olympic movement, although I can sing the national anthem better than most of them. But my path into athletics and sports administration really was through business. As was mentioned by Marissa, I was a marketing major for my MBA at BU. And, I really was mostly in financial services for, 25, 30 years. But my last job at Visa, Visa is one of the global sponsors of the Olympic movement, as you've probably seen. If you've ever turned on the Olympics, you see that Visa has a lot of ads. And so that was one of the favorite parts of my job at Visa. I had all of the sports marketing people worked with me. And that's when I went to my first Olympics in Athens, way back when, back in 2004, I think. And I kind of got the bug. And after I left Visa, I retired. This is sort of a joke because I'm not very retired, but I retired in 2007, and I really missed the sports marketing part of what I'd been doing. And I was fortunate to be recruited to be on the board of the US Olympic Committee at the time, and joined them in 2010. So I was able to kind of work my way back into that area that I had so enjoyed during my Visa career, and haven't looked back since. I've been very actively involved in many, many aspects of sports since that time.
Thank you. That's such an interesting history. I think it's interesting to hear because most people who are, as you mentioned, in the sports industry were athletes themselves. Lisa, do you feel comfortable sharing about your experience and what led you to work in athletics?
Absolutely, I'd be delighted to do so. First of all, let me just thank you all for hosting Suzanne and me. We are such good friends, and this is a wonderful opportunity for us to share our individual and our collective stories. So hats off to the Women's NBA Association, Lot Club, and Sports and Social Clubs. Just thrilled to be a part of this event tonight. Like Suzanne, many people think that I was an athlete because I have done so much work in athletics, but I'm not an athlete either, even though I attended Duke, and people assume everybody that goes to Duke plays some sport, in particular basketball. So not true. But at the end of the day, my introduction to athletics as a profession actually came through the public sector. Yes, I attended Duke. I learned the game of basketball, and it is my favorite sport, and I learned it inside and out while I was a student. But I really entered into the professional realm as vice mayor of the city of Atlanta. So through the public sector, I actually was invited to take a meeting with one of my predecessors, Donna Orander, who at that time was president of the WNBA. And she was scheduled to have a meeting with then sitting Mayor Shirley Franklin. And Mayor Franklin was working on the budget, and she had a deadline that she was trying to meet, and she called and said, would you take this meeting for me? I need to keep working on the budget. Come back and let me know what happens. I end up going to lunch with Donna Orander, and Donna made an incredible pitch for Atlanta to have a professional women's basketball team. She talked about the number of colleges and universities that we could draw from in terms of a talent pool. She talked about the media market. She talked about sports being a uniter. She made just an incredible pitch. And with the background of loving sports, having attended Duke and basketball in particular, and let's not forget my home city of Atlanta is the cradle of the civil rights movement. So we believe everybody should have an opportunity to reach their fullest potential. So that made for a wonderful mix. Donna's pitch, the city I'm from, and the background of having attended Duke and being in love with basketball. And I said to Donna over lunch, we'll take one. I went back to City Hall and I said, Mayor, it was a fantastic lunch. I told the president of the WNBA that we would take a team. And she said, you did what? I told you to take lunch. I didn't tell you to take a team. That conversation was one of the best I ever had with Donna, but I got a tongue lashing from Mayor Franklin. Suffice it to say, though, I was bit by the bug, and she subsequently was bit by the bug as well. And she said to me, listen, I'm working on the budget right now, but we've got a city to run. I'm the tip of the spear. In Atlanta, the mayor is the only full-time executive on the government side of the business. So you made that commitment, you must stand up and lead that charge. And so I was then appointed by the mayor, anointed by Big Mouth to lead the charge to bring a team to Atlanta. So raise the money, put together the strategic plan, find an owner, negotiate an arena lease. I will tell you that we put together a group of women who I thought would be equally interested and passionate about this opportunity. Stacey Abrams was in that group. She's my friend to this day. She's the one that actually negotiated the first arena lease for our then no-name team. Today it's called the Atlanta Dream. So that was the introduction, was Donna, one woman speaking to another, inviting us to be part of a solution, part of an expansion of the WNBA, which was, geez, that was back in 2006, 2007. And we brought a team to the city about 14 months later. And the rest of the story is history. So it didn't start with me being an athlete. It started with me being an advocate and an ally for women who need to have the opportunity to live out their dreams. And in this case, it was female athletes. So that's how it all started. Me and my big mouth and Mayor Franklin working on the budget.
Wow, well, it sounds like that quote, tongue lashing was well worth it. I have goosebumps just listening to it. Lisa, you mentioned that the two of you are friends. I actually listened to your podcast episode, which, by the way, fantastic. Everyone should check out Enlightened, where the two of you talked a little bit about how you met and your friendship. Could one of you give us some context? How did you meet?
Well, why don't I
turn
start?
that over to Suzanne. Suzanne, you start, yes.
I'll start because I'm the one who kind of found Lisa in this. Lisa and I met on the battlefield of a crisis. And you may recall that about 3.5 years ago, one of the biggest sexual abuse scandals that ever happened in America occurred, unfortunately, within the Olympic movement. It happened when the gymnastics doctor, it turned out, had abused hundreds of girls, and no one had noticed, apparently, or those who had been told did nothing about it. And it was an enormous crisis. And we had a giant upheaval, as you can imagine, at the U.S. Olympic and now Olympic and Paralympic Committee in trying to understand how this could have happened. So we had first commissioned an independent study from a legal firm to go and just find out who knew what, who did what when, how did this particular case evolve, and how had these girls not been protected all this time. But that pretty much, it just found the facts. It didn't really say what should you do about it. So what we next decided we needed to do was create a commission that would look absolutely top to bottom at the U.S. Olympic Committee and at all of the individual sports, and particularly gymnastics, but all the sports across the board, to see what the culture was, to see what were the structural things in place that did not protect women, that prevented women from feeling safe about speaking up. And we needed someone to lead this commission who was going to have a passion for women, who would have a good head of steam about being angry about what had happened, but would have the capability of pulling together a disparate group of stakeholders to really analyze, what needed to be done. What were the many recommendations that could come out of this terrible crisis to make sport safer for women? And I initially started by just putting together a list of probably 30 or 40, leading people in the sports world. We did think that it would be very helpful for it to be a woman. It was a very, sensitive topic. And I think for a man to have led that is maybe less, both optically not as good, but also in reality, perhaps less sensitive than having a woman who would have maybe a little bit better understanding of what these survivors had gone through to lead that. So I looked at people who were commissioners at universities. I looked at, all of the leading women. I kind of looked up, the Sports Illustrated top 50 women in sport thing and looked at the list and said, who might be great here? And pretty quickly narrowed it down to say this woman who I'd never met before, this Lisa Borders, looks pretty amazing because what she had done with the women's NBA and her very, very clear messaging about women's empowerment and her just capability also in the public sector. She had connections to the government. We knew that Washington, D.C. was very interested in seeing what we would do about this. So we began to kind of recruit Lisa and ask her to take on this behemoth task. So we could have actually been almost adversarial because her job was to find out what was wrong with my organization. But I'm happy to say that, first of all, they came up with, I think it was 90 some recommendations. Almost all of them have been implemented. And in the course of that, she and I developed so much respect for one another and so much shared passion for trying to make things safer and better and to ensure that something like this could never happen again. So in the course of that, we became kind of comrades at arms and haven't looked back since. And then Lisa, you can throw your sense of how we got together.
Oh my gosh. Well, Suzanne, you tell a perfectly tailored story. So the only thing I would add is I was grateful to receive the call from Suzanne. I was a little bit intimidated just by the scope of the opportunity or the scope of the challenge at that moment. But first and foremost, Suzanne was calling to ask me to help. So that's a woman calling, asking for support. That was number one. Number two, the crisis involved women who had been mistreated and abused. And so that resonated for me as well. And then lastly, we're all Americans and believe in sport as a unifying concept, as a unifying manifestation. And at the time, I was serving as president of the WNBA, and the WNBA is the source of the talent for the women's national team. So there was a linkage, even though Suzanne and I did not personally know one another at that moment. Over the course of the time that I spent leading this brilliant team of people, there were 9 others on the commission, I not only learned who Suzanne was, but how she was trying to lead an organization. And I frankly see it as a sign of strength when someone reaches out, when they are having a crisis. They acknowledge it, they accept it, and they act on it. That is a sign of strength. So because she asked, because women were at the center, and because the linkage was there, we are all Americans, I said yes and jumped in with both feet. But Suzanne tells the perfect story.
I absolutely love that. And I think it's so perfect that we have both of you here today. What I think is so beautiful about how you met is here you are, 2 powerhouse women, and you're collaborating to solve a structural and cultural issue that supports. I just think it's so beautiful. Let's transition to talk a little bit about today and what's going on. So Suzanne, if you were to kind of take a look back at your career, and I know you retired, so to speak, and now you're back, what would you say are some of your greatest achievements?
You know, I guess I would say one of the things that I'm proud of is that I've always tried to take advantage of opportunities that came my way that were hard. I was, for some reason, always attracted to the gnarly, difficult project or the difficult job that a lot of other people didn't want to do, because I thought it was boring to do a job that was, you know, just kind of routine and maintenance. So I kind of, it's just in my nature to say, oh, here's a real mess that needs to get untangled. And it served me well because I just, you know, I didn't actively go looking for things. Things would cross my path and I would say, oh, that seems like a really good one to get involved with. And it led me on a very interesting journey into a lot of different jobs that I never expected to have. I didn't really expect to even be in financial services. I got that job as a temp, ended up spending many, many years there. I ended up running all the call centers for Charles Schwab. I had virtually no experience that would qualify me to run 5,000 people in call centers around the country, but needed to be done. It was really interesting. And I thought of a whole lot of different ways of doing things that they hadn't done before, and, you know, really enjoyed it. And then, you know, moving into the Olympic world where I really did not know in depth, you know, the journeys of athletes and the challenges that they face. You know, I was in that movement for almost 8 years before this crisis hit. And when that happened, I had the opportunity, I was asked to become the interim CEO. Our CEO had to step down as a result of that. So I became a CEO almost overnight, unexpectedly. And, you know, was really trying to get an organization that was broken and that was kind of shell-shocked. You know, people who loved their job and loved what they did. And all of a sudden we were the bad guys. We were the people who hadn't protected hundreds of young gymnasts. And people really were, as an organization, were very broken apart. And so the skills that I actually did bring to the table, since I wasn't really, you know, a super sports administrator executive who knew a lot about that, but I knew about teams and I knew about motivation and I knew about how to lead and bring a group back together and say, this terrible thing happened, but here's what we're going to do about it. Here's our plan. And here's how we're going to go about getting out of it. And it will be okay. Here's how crises work. And eventually you get to the backside of it. So that was kind of probably my proudest achievement, was trying to pull that group back together from the brink of, you know, absolute disaster, hired a new really good CEO. I thought I was done then, by the way. I hired the new CEO. I was about to term out, and I thought, oh, I'm done. I did a good job on this. And then they asked me to become the chair. So the last 4 years, again, sort of unexpectedly, became, the chairman of the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee. My husband thinks I'm the biggest poser on the planet. He's someone who watches sports, every moment of the day, cannot believe that his wife, who, barely knew, that hockey did not have quarters, was somehow running one of the largest sports organizations in America. But so I guess that's sort of what I'm proud of. I've always taken on things that I didn't necessarily know how to do, but I figured them out.
Wow, well, you got me fooled from the way you're running the organization. You're natural for it. Lisa, how about you?
Well, I would offer a couple, and I love Suzanne's framing of figuring things out, because I've been figuring things out my entire life, and I continue to do that. And so let me start on the personal side, because most times we often think of our greatest achievements being whatever things we've done professionally. I would say my greatest achievement is raising my son. He's version 2.0, smarter, more exposed, more experienced, more open-minded, more evolved. And so bringing another human into the world and trying to make the world a better place by leaving a new footprint where someone has an open mind and an open heart is really important. So that's my greatest achievement. From a professional standpoint, I would say it is probably turning around the WNBA. And there were lots of roles that led up to the W, but let me just condense it and give you the Reader's Digest version. Having integrated an independent school, we called them private schools then, back in 1969, as the only person of color in my class of 200 at this big private school, was really an experience that set the tenor and the tone for who I am today. And I was challenged academically and got a great foundation. But what I really got beyond academics was a real immersion in the game of life, and recognizing you're not always going to be the most popular or have the most influence, that you have to figure out whatever situation you are in and navigate it. And that is something you have to do in life. That school was fantastic academically, but culturally it was very myopic, and there weren't many people of color at all. I was the only one in my class. As I moved forward professionally, what I found is oftentimes I was the only woman and the only person of color on a team, or leading a team, or in the boardroom, or in whatever meeting or whatever organization. And typically I was given some situation, much like Suzanne, where I had little to no experience, but I was expected to turn a situation around. Now, some folks might look at that and say, well, you were set up to fail. And what I would say is I was set up to learn and expand my knowledge, but also to expand the exposure and experience of those with whom I was working with and for. And so rather than be bitter about whatever situation I was in, I decided that I needed to be better and demonstrate that whatever you put me into, whatever briar patch, that I was going to find my way out of it, bring the team along with me, recognize that whatever we're trying to do was the hub of the wheel, because I always resisted the notion that working with people is like a pyramid and you're the boss that sits at the top. The metaphor I always use is a wheel, and what you're trying to do every day, whether it's sell a product or a service, that's the hub of the wheel, and everything else is a spoke, myself included. And so the wheel and the spokes and the hub must work together in order for the wheel to turn. When I got to the WNBA, that organization was struggling, would be the polite way to say it. It was really doing poorly. The attendance was flat and spiraling down. They did not have a set time on TV, on ESPN. There was no trust between the players and the league. And so my job as president was to turn the business around, But what I realized is I had never run a league before, but that the people, like in every organization, are the most important assets. And so I went about trying to build relationships and increase the trust equity between myself and the players, which accrued to the benefit of the league. When I left the league, every metric, every key KPI is what we call them in corporate parlance in sports, every key performance indicator was double-digit positive, and some of them were triple-digit positive, whether it was merchandise sales, ticket sales, or profits for individual teams. So the greatest achievement in my mind professionally was turning that particular business around, because I love sports so much, because the league was so young. It is just 25 years old this year, which is technically a generation old. And to give us some context for that, the NBA is 75 years old this year, which is 3 generations. Football is 100 years old, and baseball is 130 years old. So basketball is a younger sport, but we are finding, if you look at the data from Ernst & Young, that women who have played a sport are better leaders, whether it's at the college level, high school level, professional level. So we are finding that sports can be a real differentiator for women, and I think I intuitively knew that. But turning around that league and putting it on the map and being unapologetic about the value proposition of women and women's sports, and making sure that that league was not only sustained, but that it scaled, that I call my greatest accomplishment professionally.
Lisa, you kind of touched on this, and Suzanne, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What is the business case for women's sports?
Well, listen, at the end of the day, last time I checked, women were half of the population in this country and in the world. And we have been positioned, whether intentionally or unintentionally, as afterthoughts rather than assets. We are assets. There's a value proposition around the intellectual capital that we bring. We also bring emotional capital, but we bring financial capital to the table. And when you leave us out, you actually leave out half of the tools to make your business or your community or your organization better. McKinsey has done longitudinal studies, one in 2015, 2018, and 2020. And they talk about not only women in sports, they talk about women in general, bringing them into organizations. And that companies that do that at the senior level and even at the workforce level perform financially better. So sports is a great place to learn leadership skills and fellowship skills and team skills. And those skills are fungible, and they accrue to the benefit of organizations and communities. So at the end of the day, we're not even talking about the health skills or the health benefits, rather, that sports brings to women, which if you want to play that all out from a policy perspective, if women are healthier, then they spend less money on healthcare over time from an illness perspective, because sports is part of the prevention pill. So the business case is that women have value and add value, positive value. It's called accretive value in corporate parlance. So sports is a departure point for all these other points in life, but it is in fact a foundation and opportunity to start women at an equal place as their male counterparts, so that the contributions can be compounded in the future.
I love that.
Yeah, I think that's great, Lisa. And I'll add a couple of numbers around that. So, traditionally you will have heard, that hardly any of the sponsorships, are directed towards women, much smaller percentage of sponsorships, much smaller percentage of sports media coverage. One point, supposedly it was only 4% of sports media coverage was about women. And people were saying, well, that's because no one wants to watch it. Well, Nielsen did some research. It showed that 85% of general sports fans in their largest sports market are very interested in women's sports. I was actually at dinner with 3 gentlemen last night, and one of them was saying how they were going to watch, their college women's volleyball team today. The other one was going to watch, another women's event. And given the chance, given the support to develop really good teams that are worthy of being watched with really interesting players who people want to follow their stories, it becomes a very compelling business proposition. And, not something just that people should do because it's fair, but because it will make sense for business. And supporting, women in sport also advances companies' values. Companies that are trying to do more work in diversity and equity and inclusion right now can put their money behind their mouth to say, we are really supporting women in addition to men in our sponsorships. During the Tokyo Olympics that just happened, with the highest social media growth of all of our athletes, 8 out of 10 Olympians who had that highest social media growth were women. 54% of the athletes who competed in Tokyo were women. 58% of the broadcast coverage was women. 60% of the sports betting was on women. And 63 of the medals, by the way, were won by women. So I think it really comes down to organizations have not funded and supported women equally to men in the past, but to the extent that they begin to do that, and Title IX was the first great example of really giving support to women that hadn't existed before, and it had an enormous benefit to women participating in sports. If we can begin to raise the support behind women and sports, I think they then create a product that is of great interest to commercial stakeholders and partners, and then the business case, becomes a reality and not just something you should do. It's something businesses would want to do.
Sure. Well, you're both women in athletics. I'd love to talk a little bit about what that experience has been like for you specifically. So Suzanne, if you could start, how has your gender impacted you being in sports?
It's interesting. For all the many years I was in business, primarily domestically here in the US, I really never felt in any way discriminated against for being a woman. I was fortunate to work in some very fast growing companies, Fidelity Investments, Charles Schwab, Visa, where women were, a big percentage of the executive leadership. Women were being promoted all the time. So I never really felt like a woman executive. I was just an executive. I have to say, when I began to work internationally in sport, it was the first time that I really began to confront the fact that, it was a very male dominated environment. Older men too, not just, young men, but particularly in my world, the Olympic world, it's quite a bit of older white gentlemen, some of them princes and nobility. And they did not know what to do with women coming in who not only were female, but actually were sort of change agents. So for the first time, I kind of encountered people really not quite knowing how to deal with me and being somewhat nervous about myself. I put my CEO, who's also a woman, in the same category. We not only came in and suddenly were among the most powerful people sitting around the table, technically speaking, based on our positions, but we also had a lot of ideas about change. And that was very threatening to a lot of these people. So I have experienced, more than I have in any past job, a situation where people, are not necessarily, it's more that they're uncomfortable. They aren't really sure how to deal with women because I guess they don't have the experience that I had in my corporate life in America, where, men are used to working with women and it's really not, any kind of big deal these days. It is kind of a big deal in the world of sport that I am working with right now. So, I'm trying to be a role model. I'm trying to help begin to change that, where people begin to accept that you don't just have women around the table in sporting organizations because it's a quota. You have women there because they can contribute and because they're smart and they add value. And you should want and welcome and encourage younger women to begin to come up those paths so that they can join that table and provide real value. So it has been a little bit more challenging than I've had domestically as I've begun to experience this, but you got to start somewhere.
Sure. Well, thank you for leading the charge for us. Lisa, how about you? How has your gender impacted your work in athletics?
Like Suzanne, or unlike Suzanne, I should say, in corporate America, I actually had many, many more challenges with gender and frankly, race as well in corporate America. When I got to athletics, interestingly enough, it felt much more like a meritocracy. And people were much more inclined to listen because we were talking about athletics. And for some reason, athletics removed the stigmas of gender or race or social background or whatever. The thought was if you could put the ball through the hoop, if you could throw the ball, if you could hit the ball, then you should be part of the equation. So what I found though, when I tried to negotiate with media partners, for example, if I think about having worked at the W and literally talking with folks who were supposed to be working with us, what I found was that there was a lack of understanding of women. There was discomfort that Suzanne has explained, but there was also just flat out fear. They were afraid to have women sit beside them at a negotiation table. Or I can remember having a conversation with a media partner about giving a dedicated day and time to WNBA games. And it wasn't so much they didn't understand the business case. They understood that half the world is women, half the country is women, that Title IX that started with the bill back in 1973 was really helpful in bringing women's programs to the fore. There was not an ability to relate to the women's programs. And so those men who were making the decisions, the older white gentlemen that Suzanne is talking about, I had a couple of them admit to me that they had never watched a women's soccer game or basketball game or hockey game. So they didn't really understand it or appreciate it, and they didn't think others would either. And we had a conversation about whether they were projecting their experiences. They had done no focus groups. They hadn't looked at any empirical data. They hadn't done any research. These were uninformed biases is what they were. So I personally didn't experience challenges in athletics or leading the league, except the bias, the lens through which people looked at our product and what I was trying to do as a leader of the WNBA. In the corporate world, it was the same thing was true, but it was much more attributed, or so they said, to race rather than to gender. And remember, women came to the workforce en masse after World War II. So life has changed a lot, but then not so much if you really put a historical lens on it. And there are still those who frankly are intimidated or feel that women are trying to take their positions. We're not trying to remove men from the equation. We're trying to sit alongside men at the seat of opportunity. And therein lies the rub. There is clearly some deep concern about power and sharing it as opposed to one group having all the power. Those days are over. Women are just taking the power. If you listen to what Suzanne said about the women who won the medals and the followership on social media, a lot of that is in a democratized environment where you work hard on cultivating and curating your brand on social, and people align with it and they follow you. And so there is no intermediary. There's no one making a decision at a higher level or even any level that says you can't do this. You now have an environment which is much more available to women to stand up for themselves and bring their truth to light, whatever that is, positive, negative, or anything in between. So I didn't suffer, but I watched the league have to filter through the lens of bias.
So you both mentioned a couple different things here: fear, lack of understanding, intimidation. And before we end the conversation, we're going to actually have calls to action. You think this group of MBA students and those we have online can actually, what they can do about it. But I want to talk about the societal level. So what societal changes do we need to make to have more women involved as coaches, as players, as administrators? What concrete things need to be done so more women are stakeholders?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Suzanne,
I mean,
start?
Yeah, I'll start. I mean, part of it is participation, right from the time that kids are young. I can tell you this will age me a little bit, but there was hardly any girls' sports when I was growing up. It just didn't even exist. And now it exists. But, right at the societal level, I think we still have a culture where it's assumed that, you're going to put your little boy in little league or, make sure that the boys are doing sports. And I think we don't have an equal view that little girls need to be physically active and need to be participating in sports and benefiting particularly from team sports, as young kids. So it starts right from, I think, participation at the beginning. Secondly, I think it's support and funding. So whether that is just Title IX at the collegiate level saying that, you have to have women's sports if you have men's sports, or that you have to provide similar and comparable levels of funding so that they actually have access and they have the ability to develop the skills to become, really people you'd want to watch on a sporting field. So I think part of it is also societally the portrayal. I touched a little bit on media coverage. The media still predominantly, unless it is someone who is Simone Biles or someone who is really a household name, they still tend to cover, particularly at the less elite levels, they're covering men's sport. And until the media believes that there are many, many people who are interested in reading the stories of women athletes, that's going to continue to be a barrier. And Lisa sort of pointed, to the fact that they're kind of taking that into their own hands. Being able to build your own social media following that does take out the middleman, that actually begins to address some of that issue of perhaps male bias of saying, well, no one's going to want to read a story if I write it about a women's team. And then, kind of the other societal thing is you mentioned coaching. We've always had male coaches for, girls teams, but it's much less common to have women coaches for men's teams. We never used to have women sportscasters. There was, in my day, there was this whole thing that they couldn't go in the locker room and you could never have a sportscaster who was a woman. If you turn on, NFL football now, I think possibly the majority of a lot of the on the field sportscasters are women these days. So that can change. Society can begin to accept women in roles they haven't thought of them before, which includes coaches and trainers and people who are helping develop not just female athletes, but male athletes as well. So those are just, some of the societal areas that I think are evolving and need to continue to evolve. What did I miss, Lisa?
Suzanne, I agree with all that, and would add several exclamation points behind your comments, Suzanne. I think they are spot on. I would just add, I think there's three things, Jamie: exposure, experience, and engagement. So exposure, I remember the number one conversion factor for the WNBA was a person attending one game, just one game. And as soon as they had that exposure, they were hooked. So the notion of inviting people to participate in the experience, that's the second piece, like expose them by inviting them to whatever game, whatever activity that women are involved in, goes a long way, because then it is an informed opinion about what's working and what's not working, or who wants to see it and who doesn't. That exposure and that experience goes an incredibly long way. And when I see sportscasters in particular, I am an unyielding advocate for women's sports. So for example, in my home city of Atlanta, every time they report the sports scores, if they don't report on the Dream, I send them an email. I send them a text. When I see them in public, it could be in the grocery store, I'm asking them why they aren't reporting on the women. And then I give talks like this all the time and tell women, you've got to go into sports broadcasting. Much like Suzanne says, the folks like Doris Burke at ESPN is an exemplar. She is one person, but there are many other women who are following in her footsteps. So the path is being cut. It is not nearly as wide as it needs to be to have others engage, which is the third leg of that stool, to engage not just on the field, but behind the camera, holding the mic, you name it. There's a myriad of opportunities in sports, but you have to understand it's a moment in time where we are diversity, equity, inclusion is a topic du jour, but it really is advantageous for not just sports organizations, but for communities at large. And so it's an opportunity for us to say, this is the time to highlight what women are doing in sports, which is an entree to so much more. So exposing people, having them have a good experience, and then engaging them, particularly with the data. Folks like Ernst & Young are constantly pushing out white papers that talk about the benefit of sports and how it develops leaders and how they are good contributors to community, to companies, and to countries. That data is something we've never had before. It's all new from 2015 forward. So that's not even like 1970s with, you know, Title IX. That's like right now, 5 years, the last 5, 6 years. So I think we need to use that data and use it consistently.
Wow. Well, shameless plug for my podcast, Flame Bearers, which is all about giving the mic to diverse, unsung women Olympians and Paralympians. Hear you both loud and clear on passing the mic to more women. We're now talking questions for each of you. Suzanne, how is the preparation for the Winter Games going? Any major differences from Tokyo, and what are you most looking forward to?
Well, these two games are certainly historically unique. Having to put on global sports of this magnitude during a global pandemic, as you can imagine, was extraordinarily difficult from a logistical and reality point of view, and very, very difficult on the athletes. So let me start with Tokyo, and I'll kind of switch to Beijing. Tokyo was, you know, the lead up to Tokyo, first of all, was postponed for a year, as you probably know. The athletes could not train at the beginning of COVID. You know, you couldn't get into a pool, you couldn't go to a gym, and they had to be extraordinarily creative about developing fitness routines that they could do at home in their basement. So there was a tremendous challenge to that. They didn't know for sure if the games would happen. And then as we got closer, you know, we had to figure out, how do you keep all these people safe? How do you keep people from 206 countries coming together from just basically creating a cluster of contagion? And how do we make sure that we don't contaminate the country, the host country that we were going to? Japan had a pretty low vaccination rate at the time of the Tokyo Games this summer. It was only about 35%, and it was mostly older people. So there was a real fear in that country that we would all show up and basically, you know, turn them into a hotbed of activity. So the good news is we learned a ton in Tokyo. It was very, very difficult. We were tested every single day for COVID. We lived pretty much in a bubble. You couldn't go to a restaurant, you couldn't go shopping, you just moved between your accommodation and competition venues. No family and friends. So those athletes, you know, did not have their families with them there in Tokyo. We had to sort of set up here in the US video connections so that families could watch their kids compete. So it was a really strange games, but the good news is it worked. It all happened. They all went, they competed brilliantly. They won all kinds of, you know, world records were beaten despite their training issues, but it was very difficult. So as we go towards Beijing, we have the value of all these learnings from Tokyo. How do you bring that many people together? How do you create an even safer bubble? And the Chinese will be even tougher. Pretty much everyone will have to be vaccinated, or they have to quarantine for 21 days, which is not realistic. And even the volunteers in Japan, the volunteers all went home at night. And a lot of the cases that we did see were from Japanese citizens who were volunteering for the games. Anyone who's involved in these Beijing games is going to be in a bubble. Again, no foreign spectators, only they will allow Japanese nationals who are vaccinated. But, you know, again, you have people going without their family and friends. At least now the athletes have better training. You know, I think for the most part, they have access to training in a way they didn't in the summer. The big challenge for Beijing, for us in the US, is it's a political challenge. Our government is not friendly with the Chinese government. So we have a human rights issue happening in China that many of my athletes may feel compelled to speak out about, and that could be dangerous for them to speak out about it. So what kind of keeps me awake at night about these games is the political situation and COVID more so than the athletics, because I know they will perform. What I'm looking forward to is we haven't seen Winter Olympics in quite a while. I'm really looking forward to seeing not just our athletes, but there are amazing competitors around the world now. We are going to see Michaela Schifrin again. We're going to see Nathan Chen, the skater. You're going to see some really amazing performances by American athletes, but you'll see some incredible performances by other athletes from other nations as well. So I'm looking forward to the competitions, less looking forward to the logistics. It's going to be another real slog to figure out how we get everyone there and back again safely, but we always get it done. And I know that we will, and the athletes are resilient and they just power through no matter what adversarial things are in their path, and they're going to do it this time as well.
Well, we can't wait to tune in to cheer for Team USA. Lisa, I am completely hooked on your podcast, Enlightened. How did you launch it, and what do you hope to learn from each guest that you have on?
Oh, well, Jamie, thank you for the kind words. I appreciate that. And as you all probably know, Susanne has been on the podcast. She was kind enough to have a conversation with me. So let me answer it this way. At the age of 64, I realized that I've worked a lot of places. I've worked in all three sectors. I've had many successes. I've had some failures. I've actually learned more from failing than from succeeding. And so what I really wanted to do was share that knowledge and pay it forward, if you will. So the initial thought, Jamie, was really to write a book. And I decided that I didn't want to sit in a room by myself for 9 months and write for 6, 7, 8 hours a day, because I'm a very talkative person. And so I decided that instead of writing the book first, that I would do a podcast, because it would give me an opportunity not only to talk about some of the learnings that I've garnered during my professional career, but also give me an opportunity to learn from folks that would come onto the podcast. So as I talked with people, what I'm really trying to learn is their perspective and how they think about things and the pivots that they have made in their life based on the insights that they have garnered, going from having one perspective, going through some experience, and coming out on the other side with a different or more evolved or more mature perspective. And I have found that I've learned a lot about myself, but I've learned a ton about the others that I have invited, Susanne at the tip of the spear, who have gone through different experiences than me, but have learned even bolder lessons. So for example, Elena Deladon taught me about meditating and how to calm my spirit, calm my mind, and sit and just be. I've never done that in my entire life. But Elena challenged me to that and told me that that's one of the ways that she's been able to deal with some of her medical issues. She has Lyme disease, and so she has found solace in meditation. So I really started this as an effort to share knowledge and share information, and it is a very, I won't say easy way, but it's a self-directed way to share information. And I was able to leverage my own Rolodex in season 1. We did 26 episodes, weekly episodes. I'm not sure I really thought through all of that, Jamie, when I said I would do it every week, because there's a lot to producing an episode. But I thoroughly enjoyed it. We wrapped it at the end of August, beginning of September for season 1, and we're on hiatus now just to take a little breather, but truly excited to get started on season 2.
Wow. Well, we'll all make sure to definitely tune in. Final question from me before we open it up to Q&A. You have an online room full and a literal room full of MBA students here. What advice would you give to them as they think about their future careers, and specifically if they want to be supportive of women in sports? What concrete steps would you tell them to go through? And Suzanne, let's start with you.
Well, I think one thing that I tell all MBA students, and I'm asked this question quite a lot, as you begin to embark on your career, I always advise people, don't be so specific in what you're trying to do, so narrow in, kind of your goal of what that first job post MBA has to be. Really, those first jobs are about learning how to work in the work environment, learning how to work with teams, and learning how to really just get things done. And it's less important exactly what that first job is, because certainly in my experience, none of my jobs were really that planned. Things just kind of kept coming. I was offered opportunities to do bigger and different things, or suddenly a new company would recruit me to do something else. So I'd say be pretty flexible in those early jobs, but just be sure that you're trying to get into organizations that share your values, that share the opportunity for growth. Sometimes if you go to a place that's too small, there's really no opportunity for you to grow and try different things. So it certainly worked for me to be in a little bit larger environments early on, so I could move around a little bit and learn different things. As it relates to sports, for those of you who really are interested in pursuing sports careers or sports administration careers, it is about networking. It is, and that's true for almost all jobs. You can send in as many resumes as you want, and you will probably not get tremendous pickup. I certainly never did. But the way that you find your way into things that you really have passion for and that you want to do is you go and you talk to, maybe one or two people who are in the sports world, and you ask them to speak with you informationally. And you never leave one of those conversations without asking for names of 2 or 3 other people that they think you might want to talk with. And you just keep that networking going informationally at first, until you begin to actually start to get towards real opportunities where someone might actually have a job where they could hire you. So I highly encourage talking to as many people as you can, and don't be afraid to ask people that for a favor, to have them introduce you to someone, or you check on LinkedIn, and if they know someone that you want to talk to, don't be afraid to ask that favor. I don't think I've ever had anyone say no when I've asked them to talk to someone, as a favor to me. They've always said yes. People like to talk to young people and share their stories and help you get on your way. So, I guess that's kind of my early things. Just don't be overly focused, and talk to everyone you can possibly talk to until you begin to see a path towards something that you have real passion for.
Lisa, how about you? What advice would you give to this group?
Listen, Suzanne stole my thunder. This is why she chairs the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee. But let me add a couple of others, because those were excellent. So the first thing I would tell, particularly women MBA students, is practice self-care, because as I mentioned earlier, we're often taught in life to nurture others as women, but we're not necessarily told to negotiate or navigate life. And it starts with taking care of yourself first. So physical and mental well-being, particularly as we live through this pandemic, it is in stark relief how important it is to be in good shape. I know when I came out of business school, I thought sleep was overrated. I slept 2 hours a night, and I ate like crap, and I did not exercise on a regular basis. That's taking your body for granted, and you only get one in life. So no matter what you're trying to do from a work perspective, you are no good to anyone if you are sick. In fact, you become a burden. So the ability to be a generalist that Suzanne was talking about, or networking, none of that happens if your health is in jeopardy. So take care of yourself. The second thing I would offer is to follow your passion. Even if someone tells you no, just keep knocking on the door. To the extent that I've asked people to help me, like Suzanne, most of the time they have said yes, but sometimes they said no, or an opportunity just didn't seem to present itself. But I recall always trying to just find another way. So even if someone says, no, I can't help you, you just keep looking for that next person. As Suzanne said, when you talk to one and they say they can't help you, or if they can, ask for 2 or 3 more names. And the last thing I would mention is to lift as you climb. So as you are moving from one place to another, whether it's business school to your first job or second job or third job, make sure that you help somebody else along the way, that you don't get so busy and so consumed by what you're doing that you become myopic and you are standing alone, because no one gets anywhere by themselves. So as you network and as you climb the corporate ladder, Be thoughtful. Tell people happy birthday. Say good morning. Think of others and how you can help them in their careers too. Be nice. That's what that comes down to.
Wow. Well, thank you both for this. I selfishly want to ask questions, but we have so many people who wanted to ask questions of you. It looks like the first question we have is that it's how can we parlay the enthusiasm that women's sports sees during international competitions such as the Olympics or the World Cup into everyday domestic leagues?
Suzanne, that's a marketing question.
Well, I think it is. I was thinking about that. I think it is sort of a marketing question because, you know, it all starts, what makes people enthusiastic about watching sports? Some of it is affinity, you know, affiliation. You want to go support your team from your university or your town. But then it really comes down to, is it something I really want to watch? You know, is it exciting? Are there good players? Are there players who have interesting stories? And that's where the marketing and the, you know, kind of the telling of the stories becomes important. What I think what is part of the magic of, you know, of my world, what makes people so excited about the Olympics is that our broadcast partners like NBC do such a great job delving into the backstories. You know, how did that incredibly amazing athlete grow up? What did their family have to sacrifice to get them to the pool or to the track, you know, at 4 a.m. every single day? And those human interest stories are really what gets people very, very excited during the Olympics. So I think there's a way to kind of bring that back home, if you will, into everyday domestic leagues by making sure that, you know, you kind of play on affinity, the actual product itself, which is good sport, and then making sure that there are people knowing that that good sport is there for the taking and doing the taste test. Lisa mentioned earlier, you know, if you can get someone to sit through one game of, you know, a women's event, sometimes they're hooked. So you've got to have the taste test and make it easy. Don't charge for the tickets, you know, make it so that people can come in and easily sample the excitement of watching a women's team. And, you know, that's how you begin to gain fans. That's sort of the definition of fans. They discover you and they want to follow you and they want to support you. And we just need to see more of that for women's sports in the everyday, perhaps less elite leagues as well.
Lisa, was there anything that you wanted to add to that, or should we hop to the next question? Let's hop. So it's evident that women of color are very underrepresented in sports leadership. Can either of you speak to what you see as a barrier and the possibility of a new future?
I'm giving you the lead on
Jamie,
that one,
I
Lisa.
apologize. Okay, I'm going to ask Jamie to repeat it. My call dropped and I had to dial back in, so I only heard half the question, Jamie.
Awesome, we're back up and running. So the question was that it's evident that women of color are underrepresented in sports leadership. What do you see as limiting women of color, and what do you see as the possibility for a new and better future?
Yeah. So what's limiting for women of color, actually this is for women in general, but certainly for women of color, is that people that are making the decisions are not women of color. They're not women for the most part. And there's this notion of, I've never seen it before, so it can't really be true, or it can't really exist. Suzanne made a comment earlier in the call about we typically have not seen women be coaches of men's teams. And there are a few examples where that is changing, but they are very, very limited, like Becky Hammond with the San Antonio Spurs, for example, or Kim Ng, who's the general manager, I think, at the Marlins, if I'm not mistaken. So at the end of the day, I think it is a lack of an ability to envision a different future where there are more people who don't necessarily look exactly like the person who's making the hiring decisions, because they are not filling the pipeline with people that don't look like them. We as humans, this is regardless of gender or race or social background, we tend to relate to people who look like us, walk like us, and talk like us. That's called a comfort zone. And so our circle of friends is relatively small, and it's relatively monochromatic. So at the end of the day, we lack the exposure to appreciate the value that a different mindset or a different perspective would bring. So I think the way to change that is to have women stand up and volunteer to do, and I don't mean volunteer from a not get paid perspective, but raise their hand and say, I want to apply for X job or Y job, and take those opportunities to offer themselves, their background, their experience, what distinguishes them, and what value they can bring to the organization. These things move, frankly, at a glacial speed. They don't move quickly because oftentimes people do not want to take what they consider to be a risk. And so you have to understand that you're going to have to do that multiple times before you are going to get accepted. That's just the truth of the matter. So I find in speaking with women who are trying for jobs that no women have ever had before, or women of color, that they are going to 3, 4, and 5 jobs before they actually get the opportunity that they deserve. So I think it's like chipping away at the problem one day at a time and recognizing there will be incremental progress, and that should not be understated, but it also means you shouldn't give up.
Suzanne, is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
I think I'll just say that, some of the people that we've tried to recruit, people of color, one of the things that's a barrier to them is when they don't see anyone else who looks like them succeeding in the organization. So I think it's a little bit of a chicken and egg. You need to have those role models. You need to have people who, do seem a bit more familiar and make it seem more attainable, because it can be, it can kind of scare off or turn off a candidate, who is a person of color, if it looks like they're going to have to be the pioneer. Not everyone wants to be the pioneer. They'd like to come in where it's maybe, there's a few other people who've gotten there before them. So I'd say that's another challenge that organizations really have to, again, begin to fill the pipeline, so that not just the people doing the hiring can feel comfortable, but I think the candidates can feel more comfortable as well.
Thank you. We have time for one last question. And Lisa, I'd love to start with you on this one. What are your thoughts on the obvious difference between men and women adjacent sports, so such as hockey, no checking for women, basketball, ball size?
Wait a minute, Jamie, say that again.
Yes.
Say that question again.
What are your thoughts on the differences between men and women adjacent sports? So different rules for men and for women. So this could include something like in basketball, the ball being different, in hockey, no checking for women.
Oh, got it. Okay. So I am in the school that says I don't have a problem with that. For example, the size of the ball in basketball for women is smaller than the size of the ball for men, based on the size of their hands, I presume, is how they went about this. There is a lot of controversy around whether women should have lowering of the rim, for example, in basketball. And I have always been in the school of thought that said some women sure can shoot at the same level, but if you take into account women's size and their physical stature, I do not have a problem with lowering the rim. Many of the players today have a problem with that. I consider it customizing the game for the people who are playing it. I don't have a challenge with that whatsoever. There are lots of people who really get upset about that.
Yeah, and I can draw a parallel. The other half of my world is the Paralympic world, which is all about adaptive sports. It's all about making the sports kind of fit the capabilities of individual people and their particular disability. And when men and women's sports, for us to pretend that women are physiologically exactly the same as men would be just silly. They're not. And so for them to be their best athlete, for them to, basically perform at their peak and to basically make sport as exciting as it can be, in some cases, it makes sense for there to be adaptations that, make sense with those physiological changes. I do know a lot of women hockey players who would be happy to check But so I don't know that what being a little bit patronizing and saying that, it's too violent for women to check each other, that may not have been the right decision. But I think that there are other times when there are reasons why either the rules or the situation of men and women's sports is going to be different. And I don't think that that's a problem at all.
Lisa, Suzanne, massive thank you for all of your time. Lisa, thank you for overcoming your technological challenges, joining on the phone. Thank you to everyone joining us here and here. I'm going to pass it back to Marissa, who's going to conclude it for us.
Thank you, Jamie. That was my thank you. Was thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you to Jamie for moderating. You did a fantastic job. Thank you to Lisa. Thank you to Suzanne. Thank you all of you for coming and your wonderful questions. Just a rich conversation on women, the business case for women in sports. And again, I am a huge fan of both podcasts. I pitch for them as well. And just thank you for your time and tuning in, and have a great night.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everybody. We appreciate it. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you.